Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. We are restoring an antique chair today. We needed something really special to go with the vanity that we just restored or sort of put together. And I knew I was going to need to reupholster something to make sure that it matched. So going to an antique store knowing that you're looking for something that's messed up is really fun, because if you're motivated to restore it, then the end result can be really rewarding. I found this chair at the Hudson Antique Warehouse in Hudson, New York. It is, I'm assuming, from the 19th century. It could be even older, I don't know. But I do know that the upholstery job it currently has is at least 120 years old. So now our very first step is going to be removing all of this antique upholstery and seeing what we have to work with. I always like to be really delicate when I remove anything like this, because if you're really careful, you get a better sense of how it was constructed, how they put it together originally. And in addition to that, you can typically even use these pieces as a template on the new fabric that you're going to be applying. Ooh, I should mention, you always want to wear a mask and gloves when you are doing this kind of work. People sometimes got really creative with what they filled these chairs with in the past, and you don't want any of that going in your lungs. Another really great argument for wearing gloves when you do something like this is you don't really know who has ever set up shop inside one of these things. Sometimes these pieces of furniture have been sitting in a barn, a garage, an attic for years and years before they end up in an antique shop. And you are potentially breaking into somebody's home. So you just want to make sure that you're just very slow and careful and meticulous when you do it, and try not to scare anything that might be living inside. An additional reason that's a good argument for being very slow and meticulous while you do this is the slower you are, the less likely you are to have whatever this dust is in here to be spreading out further into the room than it needs to. Something I noticed as I was vacuuming out all of this dust and debris was that there was this bright yellow canvas strapping happening on the bottom. And so at some point, I would guess in the last 30 years, somebody has repaired this chair on the bottom. So the springs must have been poking out or doing something. There were just about a bazillion little tacks all over this thing that I needed to remove. And I tried with a plier a few times, but it seemed to be like actually like digging into the wood more than I wanted. And so I found this technique just seemed to do it pretty quickly and smoothly. I was really careful on this particular piece because I knew I wanted to iron this out and actually use it as a template for what I was going to be replacing it with. So I just went at it very carefully and just kind of tried to keep it all in one piece. Now that we've got it down to the bones, it's time to re-stabilize these springs. And the way we're going to do that is to replace all of this old twine that was holding this all together. This part can be a little bit tricky because you obviously want to make sure that you are replicating what was originally here, and these springs are actually going to be spaced just a little bit apart. So you want to just make sure that everything you're doing is kind of consistent. In addition, when you're stapling down these strands into the base of the chair, you want to make sure that they're all floating about at the same height, and that way in the finished chair everything looks really balanced. If you happen to be somebody who absolutely loves tying twine into knots, this part is going to be so much fun for you. But I'm not one of those people, and so this was so incredibly tedious to do because it's a lot of repetition, and you want to make sure those knots are really, really tight. So it does put quite a bit of a strain on your fingers too. So obviously I'm not a professional upholsterer, but I've done a few of these jobs, and something I found I like to do is to isolate the layers. So now that we've stabilized these springs, I'm going to isolate them into their own layer with some burlap. And hopefully what this will achieve is it will make the work that I'm doing last many years. Instead of needing like a really specific size of a cut, what I'm actually doing is taking a pretty large piece of burlap and just tucking under any of the excess to get it to fit exactly right. And for one, it just makes it a lot simpler. You don't have to worry about any measurements. And in addition to that, it just adds a little bit of extra padding, which this thing can't have too much of. This next part is so nice because instead of having to reinvent the wheel, all I need to do is take the original top padding that this chair had, lay it over some project foam, take a Sharpie and mark that out, and from there I can basically just duplicate what was original. Something that is so great about project foam is you don't need any fancy tool to cut it. Literally, I'm just using like a cake knife, which is also, you can use a bread knife, anything around your house to cut it, just as long as it's serrated. To continuously make this thing as soft and plush as possible, I'm now adding a layer of a polyester batting, and then once I've got this sort of situated in a way that I like, I'm going to be actually adding another layer, but this time I'll be using quilter's batting, which is just a little bit more dense. I'm now locking all of this down again with another layer of the burlap. So while I really didn't love tying all of the strings and doing all of that work, I love doing the staple work. It's just so incredibly fun. And if you do find that a few staples don't go in all the way, you can always just take a tiny little hammer and smooth those out. Now this is going really, really well, and I'm very excited. I do need to give this a little bit more of a defined, kind of a boxy shape, which is what the chair originally had. And the way I'm achieving this is instead of what they did, which was using kind of hay to create the silhouette that they wanted, I'm going to be adding just basically like extra layers of batting, and then just trying to make sure that the edges are kind of diffused so that there's no unsightly lumps or bumps. Once the front was done, and I really loved how it came out, I just continued that process along on the right and the left-hand sides of the chair. There was a decorative kind of ridge along here on the front originally, and I need to recreate that. And so the way I'm doing that is taking several layers of that quilter's batting and then just rolling up the end until I get a really kind of defined shape. In my mind, before I started this process, I pictured it being so incredibly difficult. But as you kind of like dig your fingers into it and start playing with it, you kind of realize it's not nearly as complicated as you're made to think. And there's all sorts of different ways to do certain things. So there isn't any one perfect way to do any of this. So if you ever find yourself tackling a project like this yourself, you may end up coming up with solutions I had never even thought of. we're finally to the stage that we can apply the fabric. This part is so critical, and I see this mistake done a lot in even professionally done pieces, is if you are working with a fabric that has a design on it. I'm not currently doing that, but I'm just forewarning you for work you do in the future. If there is a design, make sure whatever you do, you center that design down the middle of what you're working on. And that way that will create a beautiful amount of symmetry when you look at the piece. And I can't tell you how many things I've personally bought that I look at where the fabric is sitting and I'm like, that's not quite right. So always try to look for that. And like I said, when you get to this stage, make sure you're spending a little extra time making sure it's perfect. To make sure that the fabric is evenly taut, it's kind of a good idea to start in the center and then work your way out to the edge. And that gives you the opportunity to sort of correct any bunching that might be happening. The chair originally had a little bit of rucheted fabric here on the front edge, and I want to recreate that. So the way I'm going to do this is taking a strip of velvet that is double the width of this front piece that I'm going to be affixing it to, laying it down on the ground, making sure it has a little bit of a curvature because that's going to follow the line that I'm creating here with pins. And then from here, I'm actually going to start affixing the fabric with pins, kind of finding where I want it to sit. This is a really great technique to make sure that you've obviously got enough fabric for one, and then for two, everything is going to be spaced really evenly and you have a little bit of time to play before you start permanently stitching it in. Once I had stitched the top and I was super happy with how it turned out, I began stapling it down on the bottom. My initial staples were all spaced, I would say about 2 inches apart, and this kind of allowed me to control how things were gathering. And then as I knew it was gonna kind of lay perfectly, then I started bunching up my staples right next to one another. It's now time to start affixing the trim, and the way I do this is I lay down the trim, pin it in place, and then once I know it's just right, I start sewing it in permanently. And then for the sides where the fabric meets the wood, I'm actually using a hot glue gun to initially get it to lay down just right, and then from there I'm just going to use a brad nailer to make it permanent. If you do by chance find any of the brads are visible, you can always just take a little tiny bit of acrylic paint and cover up the head of them. The seat is now finished and it's unbelievably comfortable, thank God. And now it's time to start working on the backrest. I'm going to begin this part by creating a grid using canvas straps that I'm going to just be stapling in here. And what this is going to do is kind of just create a support piece that I can actually build on top of. Once that's done, I'm going to staple on a layer of burlap to the front and back. To prevent the burlap from fraying at all, once I had done all of my staples, I took a hot glue gun and just went around all of the edges. So I could have just reused the original pad. There was really nothing really wrong with it, aside from the fact that it was filled with so much dust and honestly, who knows what else? It could have the Black Plague in there for all I know. So I am going to be replacing it, and there's kind of two benefits to this. Is obviously the first one, it's going to be clean and fresh, and you're not going to know that there's some dirty little secret under there. And also you kind of learn a new technique in how to create something different. So it's kind of a win-win all around. One of the nice things about being careful of when we took this apart was now I have this piece to use as a template. And so I'm just going to outline this onto some project foam, and I'm even going to replicate where the tufted buttons sat. The way they originally created this padding that went on that backrest was by combining a kind of odd amount of materials, like from wool, straw, all sorts of things I could find in there, and essentially built up the shape. Now I'm going to be doing the same thing, just essentially working in reverse and just subtracting the shape I need from this foam. When you're creating one of these tufted panels, you have all of these diagonal lines in the center, which are pretty easy to follow. But once you get out to the edge, it just sort of, you kind of have to figure out where you're going from there. And what I think looks the best is if you just go straight out, don't try to continue the diamond pattern. And this just creates something really uniform and elegant looking. This part was messy, but honestly really fun, I thought, just because you just keep chiseling away at it and then you put it up, see what it looks like, bring it back down, take off what you need, and it's kind of hard to go wrong. You just slowly take off little bits by little bits until it has the exact shape that you're going for. Figuring out the dimensions for this actual finishing piece of fabric that's going to go over this tufted section was super easy because all I had to do was iron out that original piece and then just duplicate the exact cut and the placement of those dots. Once I was really happy with how my foam shape had turned out, I then took some quilter's batting and just went over it and tucked it into all of the little nooks and crannies. And this is just going to kind of round everything out, smooth everything so that it looks really beautiful. To affix the panel to the backrest, I'm just taking some twine and piercing it through twice and then tying it together in the back. Now the foundation is done. I love how it looks, and it's time to prepare this final layer of velvet that's going to go over it, in addition to making some new buttons. To make the buttons, I'm just doing the same thing I did in that last episode where we did the upholstery inside the vanity. And it's just one of these button making kits that you can just pick up at any hobby store, and it's so easy to make your own. On my final top fabric, on the back side, I'm using a Sharpie to mark exactly where the little buttons are going to go. And then on the outside, I'm cutting extra fabric, so I have a little bit more to play with in case anything goes awry. To prep this top layer and get the buttons ready, I take a length of twine that's probably about a foot long, and then I just pierce it through one needle, go in once, loop the button on, get it on the needle again, and then pierce it back through. To affix this fabric, what you're going to do is you'll have those two strands floating around on the back of the finishing fabric, and one by one you want to thread one thread at a time, pierce it through, then thread the next thread, pierce it through. You don't want them going in together because when they are separate from one another, usually about a half an inch or so, It gives you a little bit of something to tie together and really lock it onto this back. You want to make sure that you've used a really heavy duty twine when you do this, because we are going to be tying these so tight that anything too weak will just break, and you don't want that to happen. And so you just tie these as tight as you possibly can get them, and that will pull the button exactly to where you need it. We can now start stapling down the edges, and the way you want to do this is you want to keep all of the tension right there in the center line where that fold is, and do the least amount of tension right there, kind of where you want it to puff a bit. Let's talk about staple guns. This is the only staple gun I've ever had. They're both pneumatic, meaning they run off of an air compressor. And something I didn't realize until this particular project is there are some really difficult places to get to where obviously the toughening meets the armrest of the chair. And so the captive did a little research and he found this thing, and it has an elongated nose that really allows you to get into all of the nooks and crannies. We weren't able to use it on this particular project, but in the future we absolutely will. And I just wanted to let you know that this is out there. To prevent any of these knots that I've tied from poking out and sort of affecting how pretty the back looks, I'm stapling on a layer of that quilter's batting. I can now finally trim away the excess and get ready to finish this chair by putting that final piping on the back. There were a few paint scuffs on the wood, and so the very last step I'm going to do is to take a magic eraser, buff that out, and then once that's done, just take a few drops of Old English and go over all of the wood. All right, I'm so happy with how this came out. And now that I know that I can do this, there's a million chairs around this house that need this done. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We are getting that much closer to this room being complete, which I'm so excited to show you. I can't wait. So until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.